Hello, and welcome to Varn Vlog. And the world is burning, but it always is. That's the nature of the world. I woke up on Sunday morning to the news that President Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela had been arrested, more likely kidnapped, brought to U.S. jurisdiction to face a New York court trial for being a narco trafficker for a gang that the government itself no longer recognizes as existing, as they removed it from the charges. Trump goes on and states that this is explicitly about blood for oil, but at a time when oil is at a pretty low point on the market. In fact, I think it's the lowest in raw numbers since COVID, and adjusted for inflation, probably the lowest it's been in quite a while. With the Venezuelan infrastructure pretty degraded since it quit being used sometime around 2014, 2015, with the first oil market crash happen in the mid-teens. The ironies are everywhere. Yes, this is only a few months after the U.S. pardoned Juan Orlando Hernandez, so there's no doctrine to be claimed here. The only doctrine is the Donoe Doctrine, which is in keeping with all the multipolarity you've been talking about. I know there was an article today about why not the U.S. as a world thug over in Compact Magazine. I'm not going to talk about it beyond that. If anyone takes that stuff seriously, then I don't know why you're here. But I have some things that are going to make the anti-imperialist left probably a little bit uncomfortable too, since all the talk of multipolarity, this is absolutely consistent with the theory of multipolarity. From A.H. Carr to Morgenthau to even Dugan, this is what it means. Shifting your influence to your sphere, the poles being the great powers. Now, no one ever talks about what it means that three of the great powers share a fucking border, India, China, and Russia. But that historically doesn't end well. But nonetheless, that is what this is. It's just in its raw, unadulterated form. Now, never mind you, this is still happening while the U.S. is aiding Nigeria in fighting Boko Haram, a name that I hadn't heard in a while, but apparently is an issue. But as the New York Times reported today, they seem to be just dropping bombs on Muslim farming communities. So we're not totally only in this hemisphere yet, but between that and all the forays about Greenland, it looks like NATO's on its last legs, at least with the US as part of it. Don't take my word on that. Things are weird. I'm not predicting that for sure. It's just the tensions towards Greenland put a direct imperative to end NATO. In fact, that's why you would do it. The U.S. will not accept another regional hegemon anywhere. Well, it already kind of does and kind of doesn't. It won't formally accept it, and thus we are in a Thucydides trap, most likely. What 1,000 Thucydides traps bloom? What? That was my friend DVE, who I was just quoting, and this is JB Funk. Cutting out the American project of all places had an interesting take, giving the DOJ credit for pulling this off. With Delcy Rodriguez now in power, broken clock. I've seen some people who claim that the Delcy Rodriguez thing was an internal coup, and this is not really about U.S. policy. You also have people like John Fabro complaining that they left parts of the Maduro regime in power, even though this was an illegitimate military act. I don't know. The fact that they're only claiming 40 dead, it almost certainly is more than that, but not doesn't seem like it's a lot more than that. But we know it's more than that since 32 of them are Cubans. And we also have heard reports of much of uh, Maduro's personal security team being killed from Venezuela itself. It is a little weird that there was not more Venezuela's own security team there. It's a little weird that Delcy Rodriguez seems to be able to stay in power, although there's discussion of independent drones flying around today. Who knows if we have if this is what it is. People are projecting all sorts of meaning to it. China says it's going to fight this by, survey says, sending in a bunch of lawyers to battle over debts due over the Belt and Road Initiative. And some people were celebrating that as principled anti-imperialism. Now, I'm not here to say that China isn't trying to defend its own interests, but that's all that is. Yeah, we got Trump claiming that chopper struck damage and the Delta Force was injured. I don't doubt that, actually. But I don't know. I'm releasing a video on the dangers of conspiracism, although I did say conspiracies happen. Look at the Epstein files, and apparently I've been reading that in a way that's been making me think that I soft paddled things 5 years ago. Here's my point. This is both weird and utterly predictable. It's weird in that none of the stories totally add up to me. The same day you had a Chinese delegation in Venezuela and a medical boat that was supposedly staged for something else at hand. Oil companies knew about this, and yet the oil investigators don't totally make sense. And this was after 3 weeks of us hearing very little out of this administration domestically or internationally due to the holidays and silence around the Epstein files. By the way, which were supposed to be this weekend, there was a deadline on explaining the nature of the redactions and what was released according to the recently passed by the Republican Congress law. And that didn't happen. That didn't happen at all. It's also a $19 million lawsuit, which again, China's threatening to store it for its own interest in. Yeah, I know that medical boat was around for Jamaican hurricane relief. I'm aware of that, and I believe that was why it was there. But it did stay there, and it was close by. We don't know. Who knows what? China's statements that I've seen translated into English. I've been going to Sign Assist to get translated statements. Have been pretty strong about this. There were all kinds of rumors that Delcy Rodriguez was in Russia and that Russia knew about it. Who the hell knows? That also seems weird. But it does seem like even a lot of allies are going to condemn this as a unilateral act. Basically, what is clear to me is something that we've been seeing unwind since the Bush administration, which the international rule of law, which, by the way, are treaty obligations that have never been completely respected by any signatory ever. So we can get into that if you want to. But we've had Trump threaten at least 6 other countries, leaders. We got Steinbaum, we got Colombia, we've got Greenland, maybe Canada, and Iran being the only one outside of the Northern Hemisphere. So who knows what all of this means. I don't. I'm not pretending to. I am tired of pundits, random ass people who get an audience, telling people stories that they want to hear. I'm also not here to cast aspersions or blame or excuses for anything of the prior Maduro regime. But the only thing I've had to say about this, as I said in a video that I released earlier today, is oil rent socialism or oil rent welfareism was a lot of what Chavismo have been reduced to because of sanctions and a lot of other things, and that hasn't really worked since the mid-aughts. And now I was going to leave it at that, and I still kind of am. I mean, Maduro is not under U.S. jurisdiction by any stretch of the imagination, and now we are claiming jurisdiction over this, over all of the Americas. So it is a return to the Donoe Doctrine, and it is a Hadrian's Walling of Empire. It looks like we are pivoting away from Eurasia. Yeah, I don't think you can get this from U.S. media sources either, and I'm even reading foreign sources. Just to remind you, I can read Spanish. Mi español es poquito y muy gringo, sí. Pero entiendo. Particularmente Leo. And for those of you who speak Spanish, I apologize. But I can read it. What do you think Trump's action against Mexico would look like if he took such an action that has profounder claims on America? One, it's divisive within the United States. Two, Steinbaum, I mean, even though there's probably been legitimate protests against Sarah, Steinbaum's one of the most popular presidents on the planet. And it's the one thing to remember with countries with large nations, you can have a very large protest against a very popular president, particularly if you have any astroturfing at all. So the Donoe Doctrine is a way to actually reduce the need for the U.S. to be the guarantor of Europe's security and of all deep water trade, while still being able to thwart its imperial might. It's essentially a Hadrian's Walling of the empire. That doesn't mean that you won't see expansion. What that means is expansion is going to shift its focus to more local concerns. Oh yeah, I mean Steinbaum is a good left populist. He's also good in business, which is very rare. I mean the U.S. also, I mean, has an allergy to boots on the ground, even if Trump says we don't. So Trump seems to be trying to do his paleoconness and neocon pipeline by focusing on special forces operations, which is you break it, then instead of you bought it, you run away really fast. And when people talk about Cuba, I forgot to mention the threat against Cuba. Thank you. Cuba's liberalizations during COVID were part of those protests. They weren't really, against the communist regime as much as they were against liberalizations and what that caused, liberalizations of their dual currency. Yeah, if I was Cuba, I'd be worried too. Now, the Trump administration unraveling could still very easily be happening. I mean, we know Kash Patel has lied under oath to Congress, although Congress doesn't seem to care. We know that, we know this for a fact. He he has, for example, said that there was no one else implicated in the Epstein trafficking, but Epstein trafficking to himself. The very files the DOJ released, even in the parts they didn't redact, proves that to be manifestly untrue. It also proves Megyn Kelly's story that this was just about them trafficking in 16 to 18-year-olds who were willing to know what they were doing, also untrue. The whole hebephile bullshit she was trying to pull. But what Kash Patel did would be actionable if anyone had the balls to act on it, when they probably don't. So, you know, I do think the decline of domestic policies, while you're seeing this push in optics for the Donoe Doctrine and foreign adventurism, even if you're not necessarily seeing it in terms of foreign wars. But who knows how long you continue doing this bullshit and there not be foreign wars. Cuba is not dependent on oil, but also doesn't have many local allies. That's where you go. Colombia, you know, trolling Trump back. Colombia's president trolling Trump back was kind of funny. But NATO, I mean, when you have Trump continually saying we need Greenland, which would effectively end NATO, he knows that. Now, I want to read something to you guys. I know this is something a radical engagements kind of thing. I will retroactively put this in the post because I think this gives me some way to figure out the economics of all this. Because when I first read about this, I was like, oil's down right now. I know that there are refineries built in the early aughts that were for heavy crude because that's what we thought we were going to get. And then shale oil produces light, relatively easy to refine crude, but we don't have refineries for that. We've been buying heavier crude from Canada and from the Gulf states to mix with our light crude to make it more palatable. And there is some sense that if you built the oil infrastructure back up in Venezuela, that would make sense as an investment. But I honestly think that's really more about securing oil futures, which is what the Iraq war was. When people are like, oh, they're just going in for scarce oil. No, they really kind of weren't. The anti-ICE activities, I mean, we still have ICE raids going on, although the ramp up and ramp down after Chicago and the trying to use this force, the military force internally. I mean, one of the things you have to look at with this administration is not only can't even keep up with all the bullshit Trump says. Trying to fact check it's just impossible now. The craven biases of some fact checkers towards the center of the Democratic Party has not helped the fact that now no one tries to do this at all. You have the fact that media is not as profitable of a industry bet anymore, which is why there's so much dependence on the FCC to lay down terms on content in order to allow what, you know, bends and rules for even larger consolidations. See the Discovery Time Warner merger, et cetera. But we're even seeing ICE raids here in Utah. Like, I've seen them firsthand. So, you know, it's a dark, dark time for all this stuff. But let me read this article. It'll help you. And then I'm going to take some questions. But don't ask me to be a pundit or to make predictions, okay? Because, like, Right now, I have seen so many. I was watching what's that? What's his name? Not Clapperstein, the other one who's the left winger. Is like the reason why people hate the left is we're right earlier than everyone else. And I'm like, some of us are, but most of us actually aren't. That's not why we're hated. We're hated because we're harder to recuperate because our goals are not as recuperatable. That's the one good thing I can say about us. And B, we're annoying. Not Clapperstein. It was not Clapperstein. It was the other Kulinski. Thank you, because they both have KK names. It was Kulinski who said it. My program has grown because of I don't want to talk about my day job explicitly, but yeah, it's related to some stuff in the thing. Let me get to the actual article. I like Hayek's Bastards. I actually think it's quite interesting as a historical piece. Someone asked me, what do I think of Quinn Slobodian's work? And I think that's how you pronounce that. Enough that I was thinking about asking him on the show. I have lined up a bunch of academics and specialists for the new year, and I felt like I kind of fell off the wagon on interviews in the middle of this year because of my you can barely see it now, but my tumor removal. Yes, this is a Spelljammer shirt. So I'm hoping to make up for that in the new year with a wild variety of range of guests. I've also been asked to host a forum on the Rock Hill book. I am going back and forth on it. I am mixed on the book. I don't think it's worthless. I don't think it's just conspiracy mongering. But there are parts of it that I think are kind of weak. But I want to finish reading the book before I interview him or say anything more formally about it. So yeah. Any opinions on Chris Catrone? Why the fuck do you guys do this to me? I mean, why not imperialism 35 times? Do you have anything better to do than to ask me about people I explicitly broke? I mean, in the case of Platypus Affiliated Society, I explicitly broke with them 13 years ago. Just quit it. Stop it. You know, my former boss, whose name I'm not even going to mention, but he spends a lot of time mentioning me on his show, apparently. I've had someone send me a reel of clips in the last year, mostly complaining about my ad hominems. And I've not even mentioned him on my show, but you fuckers keep on bringing it up. Yeah, it's rage bait. I think Chris shares what he actually believes in so much that you can tell what he actually believes because he also puts pivots and everything so we can claim the strong claim is not what it is. All right, back to this thing. Since you guys have got me off mine, don't mention certain things. Good advice. Too late. I'm sorry, I'm later in the newsroom. I apologize. It's okay. You don't. It's okay. Am I a Cossack supremacist? No. Why would I be a Cossack supremacist? That's also rage bait. All right. Within hours of the U.S. military strikes in Venezuela and its capture of its president, Nicolas Maduro, President Trump proclaimed very large oil companies will go in, spend billions of dollars, fix badly broken infrastructure, and start making money for the country. Trump did not hide that the major reason for the attack and the kidnapping of Maduro was aimed at putting U.S. in control of Venezuela's vast oil reserves, described as our oil by Trump. Venezuela holds the world's largest oil reserves. Yep. About 303 billion barrels, are 17% of global reserves, surpassing OPEC leader Saudi Arabia, according to the London-based Energy Institute. But despite its vast reserves, Venezuela's crude output remains far below capacity. Production, which peaked at about 3.5 million barrels per day in the 1970s, over 7% of global output, fell below 2 billion BBT during the 2010s, and has averaged just at 1.1 million BBT last year. See timeline. Ooh, this is from the U.S. Energy Information Administration. You can see ramp up. You see a dip when Chavez comes to power in 1998. Wrap up again. Chavez uses that to fund a lot of his experiments. Brief oil strike during political unrest, which majorly drops production. You see a decline because of the declining price of oil post the Iraq War. U.S. Under Trump, U.S. sanctions Venezuela's oil company. You see further declines. Sanctions enacted in 2019, and this is all while the global oil market is coming down. So in 2025, U.S. authorizes Chevron to resume oil production in Venezuela. All right. The U.S. is now the world's biggest producer thanks to the so-called shale revolution in the 2000s. Yeah, we're the biggest producer of oil. We actually have oil independency, which you used to hear all about, but no one talks about it anymore because it doesn't mean what people thought it was going to mean. But that has meant the world is increasingly awash in oil as supply outstrips global demand growth, which is slowing due to crawling economic expansion in most major economies, not to mention declining population sizes, which are going to start to decline in the major economies, and to the gradual switch to renewables for energy production, although emphasis on gradual, particularly things that need lots of electrical, like, say, electric vehicles, have had problems because they're not cheap anymore. Thank you, AI, raising the price of electricity as an answer. Also, electric cars are only clean as the sources of electricity. Indeed, at the time of the attack on Venezuela, the price benchmarks of Brent crude oil was close to a 5-year lows at about $60 a barrel. You can see we hit a low in 2020. We hit a high in 2020, the inflation spike in 2022, but we've been trending downward since then. Trump may be telling the global oil majors that he is running Venezuela now, although how he's doing it and through whom, no one fucking knows. And they can pitch this to invest and make piles of money, but oil companies may be less sure of that. And ex-Chevron, etc., Ali Moshiri is making a pitch to raise $2 billion to take over multiple Venezuelan assets. But this is a punt. And the likes of Chevron itself, which also has a license from U.S. Oil to drill and produce Venezuelan oil, may not be able to be so gung-ho. The cost of restoring Venezuela's oil production will not be cheap, as the industry has dilapidated drilling infrastructure and the oil extracted is heavy. It's very heavy crude. Extracting this extra heavy oil requires drilling lots of relatively short-lived wells, a process quite similar to U.S. shale production, then mixing the sludge with lighter oil or naphtha so it can flow through pipelines before being exported and then refined. Producing heavy oil requires advanced techniques such as steam injection, blending with lighter crudes to make it marketable. Also, the country's reserves are mostly concentrated in the Orinoco Belt, a vast remote region in the eastern part of the country, stretching across roughly 55,000 square kilometers. Moreover, the oil glut has already started to hit profits on further exploration and extraction. The U.S. shale industry cumulative losses in the 2010s reached close to $500 billion. Everything depends on break-even price, which has been estimated at an average of about $60 per barrel at American share. All this according, against the backdrop of oil supply growing faster than demand, with the International Energy Agency projecting global supply increases of 30 million barrels a day in 2025, a further 2.4 million in 2026, against demand increase of only 830,000 barrels in 2025 and 860,000 barrels in 2026. Jorge Leon from the Rystad Energy estimates that roughly doubling the production to 2 million barrels by the early 2030s would cost 115 billion. Some 3 times ExxonMobil and Chevron's combined capital expenditure last year. Could ExxonMobil and Chevron make that more profitable in current world supply and demand balance for oil, especially such heavy oil would need to be sold below the market price? However, there are other factors behind Trump's move against Venezuela. The new national security strategy made it clear. Now, I want to tell you guys, for all this talk about anti-imperialism, blah, 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 there is an official statement by the PRC that the new energy security strategy actually reduced tensions between the two countries on geopolitical grounds. Because, frankly, we're pivoting away from Asia, which, kind of think we should. But nonetheless, the Donoe Doctrine of the 1820s is back on steroids. Yeah, of course it is. I mean, that's how you Hadrian's Wall without Hadrian's wallet. Back then, President Monroe declared that European nations must not interfere or try to control Latin America, as this is now the sphere of influence for the United States of America. Now, and I've said this multiple times, multipolarity can go many different ways, but this was most likely the way people were going to interpret it. Now, under Trump, globalization has given way to making America great again by firmly establishing Latin America as U.S. imperialism's backyard, like we did in the Eisenhower administration and that we tried to do in the entirety of the 18th and 19th century. This by no means can be allowed to resist U.S. policy interests. Friendly regimes must be installed to enable both privileged Americans' use of resources and the ability to deny those to the competitors. That means growing Chinese influence and investment in the region must be blocked. While Venezuelan oil makes up to 300,000 of the 11.3 million barrels China imported each year in 2025, according to the Oxford Institute of Energy Studies, companies from the People's Republic gain a foothold in Venezuela's oil industry. Back in 2024, at the time of the disputed re-election of Maduro, I'm not going to go into that case, I pointed out that the Venezuelan capitalism was tied closely to the profitability of the energy sector, like duh, which was in a death spiral after collapse of oil prices after 2010, and then a further death spiral after U.S. sanctions. The gains for the working class achieved under Chavez in the 2000s were only possible because oil prices have reached their zenith. But then commodity prices, including oil, dropped. Because real commodities tend to do that. And I don't know, maybe there's a tendency of the rate of profits on commodities to fall or some shit. This more or less coincided with Chavez's death. The Maduro government lost support of its working class base as hyperinflated and destroyed its living standards. I know we're not supposed to say that, but it seems to be somewhat true. The Maduro government increasingly relied not on the support of the working class, but on the armed forces, which had special privileges. The military could buy in exclusive markets, for example, on military bases, had privileged access to loan and purchases of cars and apartments and substantial salary increases. They also exploited exchange controls and subsidies, for example, by selling cheap gasoline purchased in the neighboring countries with huge profits. The tragedy of Venezuela is that everything depended on the oil price. By the way, this is why I don't really trust market socialism, and I'll get back to that. But there's a little or no development on non-oil sectors, which was anyway were in the hands of private companies. There are no independent national plan of investment controlled by the state. Given U.S. sanctions on top of that, the continued subversion of the government, Chavista Revolution's days were numbered. It's a lesson for all of Latin America. Deindustrialization of the subcontinent since the 1980s and the increasing reliance on commodity exports subject all these economies to volatile swings of commodity prices, agricultural, metal, and oils. That makes it impossible for any independent economic policy, given the weakness of domestic capitalists and economies under the shadow of American imperialism. I want to add to that a couple of things. One, you have seen the organic rate of capital increase, meaning that there's more fixed capital in the production market, meaning there's less workers. That's true everywhere. Field Nil's documented pretty well, and it shows up in Hell World and some of his articles. If you can get through the what Phil calls the deliberate torture of the book, that building industrial production and developing economies doesn't work the same way anymore, because the organic capital means that you need fewer and fewer workers to actually produce commodities, which means the gains are actually somewhat limited to rich holders of that capital. And I'll put that into you in simple non-Marxist terms for a second. Basically, it takes less people to run a factory, which produces less jobs, leads to less spending power, and you see K-shaped economies everywhere. So, what can you say about that? I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I really don't know. China is the only country fighting the K-shaped economy thing. Its automation seems to be able to be dealing with the fact that it knows it's going to have a population decline relatively soon. Although, it's trying things like outlawing condoms to increase the population, which does kind of not bode well. For those of you pronatalists out there, and I'm not anti or pro pronatalism, no policy has worked in developed capital to reverse baby declines, because having babies is now an economic liability. So, Varn, can you predict if you're going to yell at someone in practice? Already have. Someone mentioned a C word. Would that mean China's push for immigrations? Asked One Tone. I don't know. I actually don't know. I think China's been much more careful and much more strategic and much more, frankly, efficient in its development and use of AI. And I don't think we in the West actually even know the full extent of this. But from what you read about Chinese factories, they are dealing with it. Manuel Wallerstein always pushed for the development of China, but also because it thought it would exacerbate the contradictions in capitalism, as would social democracies in general, which would encourage the workers to take more desperate actions. He's basically one of the last immiserationists. I did an interview with an independent Wallerstein scholar on this recently. So I have no idea what to make of that, but that's where I think we are. As China is the most responsible major power right now, that's the most I can say about it. Does it mean it's going to take the stances everyone wants it to take? Probably not. And you see how people felt about it on Israel. I'm not interested in doing dialectical defenses of that anymore. I am interested in dialectically defending the Chinese support of the U.S. war on terror in the aughts, but states are going to state. So, as far as the way forward, I mean, we have a lot of talk about Mamdani. Mamdani's cabinet is pretty much the kind of people you'd expect from de Blasio or even Obama, particularly his housing person. But he did stand up to Tish. He has established these like community grievance councils for landlords. Will they have any teeth? Who knows? Probably not. I mean, socialism in one city seems to be a very weird thing, particularly for Jacobin, who campaigned against localism for the entirety of the rest of its fucking tenure. To be for it now is something interesting. Mamdani is not doing the same things as Brandon Johnson, but he will be absolutely constrained by the bond market on actually delivering on those policies. Plus, we already know that am I really that much of a nerd? Yeah, I'm that much of a nerd. Books. Real books. I used to do on this very channel a gaming show once a month with Gene Bajelon. So I don't know what Mamdani is going to end up being, but his cabinet doesn't give me the kind of absolute sinking pit that I got from the Obama cabinet in 2008. But it does give me those sinking pit feelings. Now, let's talk about a few things about this. U.S. Congress, including the Republican part, seem to be the last to know to even how to suck up to the president on this. You have the center leadership of the Dems actually saying that they should pull an Iraq in 2020 and 2002 on this. Yeah. I was told Mamdani was part of the DSA. He was. Surely they have a team and a strategy in place for their new elected. Yes. I mean, Mamdani already moved his campaign focus to its own subgroup, kind of like I think called Our Times, kind of like Our Revolution was for Bernie Sanders. I've already commented on this channel that progressive campaign advocacy groups came out of Our Revolution and played the game, but they play the game. I mean, like the biggest group that come out of that and the Justice Dems, their biggest victory was John Featherman. I also think that's why they tried to nationalize the Graham-Plattner issue. So they could get more money from outside of Maine into the Plattner campaign, even if it was bad publicity, it was still publicity. And, who knows? I have no idea how Plattner will be. I have no idea if he'll be another John Fetterman or not, but there's no way to know. And there's no way the DSA or even left progressives, because Plattner doesn't even call himself a socialist, could actually hold electeds accountable. Because let's be quite frank about that talk. All right. Now, for those of you who don't know, I got cyberbullied into joining the DSA. And for complaining about what I thought was going to happen with Mamdani, because I'm now in the DSA and I can tell you a lot of the stuff that I'm concerned about. We are focusing on electoral strategies here in Salt Lake, where we have had very few electoral wins. And we have a lot of trouble, and I'm not saying this like there just isn't a lot of interest in stuff like the labor committee. So yeah. I've been told that, and I've even heard this language from the people pushing for this, that the goal is to eventually form their own party. But this reminds me of the Ackerman plan a decade ago, where the trigger conditions for your own party are infinitely down the line because there's always a crisis to not do it. And let's be frank, at this point in U.S. politics, you really would need to do what the Marxist Unity Group is suggesting and rewrite the Constitution for any of this to matter. And when someone says, who's Jacobin consistency, just New York, I do want to point out that the DSA's statistics that I've looked at seem to indicate that between an 8th and 11th of the entire organization is in the greater New York City area. Well, and that sort of makes sense given the size of New York City, but then also it means that the Nationals effectively made New York City politics something that the entire DSA argues about, down to who the fucking comptroller is. And these other city bases are trying to replicate that without matching funds, which New York City has, but no one else does, without ranked choice voting, without large budgets. Also, the DSA is technically, informally, an NGO, so there are limits to what it can give to candidates. So, like, its candidate grants for something like $7,000 or $8,000 or something like that. So there's no way they can compete with the Democratic Party, which is not an NGO, on funding and funneling funding to these candidates. Furthermore, in no place that a DSA elected, even if they're a cadre elected, has won, is the DSA the majority of that constituency. Nowhere. There are no mods here. Now, yeah, I am a Bonaparte of this stream. Tin Pot Bonaparte of a stream is a really pathetic thing to be. All right, for someone who asked me earlier about my feelings about a certain Mr. Catrone, I'm just going to answer very quickly. The first Why Not Trump article all the way back in 2016, I actually agreed with under the premise that they're both heads of an empire. Why not pick the one that's going to force the empire to a head? But those articles increasingly got to actual defenses of just Republican foreign policy that bend to the wind of whatever that they're saying. In fact, I've actually said that this fraction of socialists who respond to the despondency of the left. I mean, we all respond to the despondency of the left. Like, have you dealt with leftists? Like, it's not always easy. So getting on an outright and saying that, like, maybe, you know, picking up some writings from Marx from the 1830s or 1840s, not the 1830s, there aren't writings from Marx that early, that matter. And then I think there's his thesis on Epicurus somewhere, and there's parts of that. To pick up, you know, why not return to the Monroe Doctrine? Why not do whatever this goes? And, you know, if you're trying to force those contradictions, I suppose that's a way to do it. But it seems like just endorsing Bonapartism in a way that it's pretty explicit that Marx was against. And we know this from a variety of letters from Marx and Engels. And not just from Hal Draper. I've caught Hal Draper, if you are behind the Patreon, I've caught Hal Draper making some real big claims on some letters when I went and looked up the letters, and I didn't see what he was saying. But, you know, I get tired of just talking about other pundits. You guys don't ask me about, like, people used to ask me about what I thought about Jimmy Dore. And I'd be like, I mean, if you want a prediction about what the Democrats are going to do, listen to Dore. If you want a prediction about anything else, don't. You know, and a lot of these people have faded as Trump star has risen. What do you think about Doug Lane? Okay, now you really are just trolling me. How are bond markets brought under control? That's actually a good question that I don't entirely know the answer to, because nobody can admit how complicated the bond markets are, since they're even tied up into international treaty law. What do you think about Matt Taibbi fucking? Suing critical support for Higgins. Am I getting enough sleep? I'm sleeping more than I used to. Saw some Berserk anime adaptations. The original one is bad, but it's the best of the bunch. Why do you guys always ask that? Bond markets. There's one way. I mean, somebody suggested buying bonds of other areas to offset your own bonds, and I'm like, but in most municipalities that would require you selling bonds, because there's often local laws that require bond purchasing before raising taxes. If you want to get rid of the bond market, you basically have to the bond market is as old as capitalism. And arguably, it's older than capitalism. The first bond market is in the Republic of Venice in the 12th century. Now, I'm also watching like MSN News right now. It's not MSNBC, is not tied to it. Like literally forced on my computer, making claims about Trump tax cuts going to really help people. And I'm just aghast by all that. Now there's MS Now, which is something else. What do you think about the possibility, as well as it sounds about municipal banking? I mean, the issue with municipal banking is that if you're funding the government off of municipal banking, you're still effectively selling bonds. You could, the other way to raise revenues is raise taxes, which is going to be hard to do at a municipal level because of capital flight. So, do you see the USA continue to pay $1 trillion in interest on treasury notes forever? I don't really know how it gets out of it. I mean, no, I don't see it, but I also don't know how it gets out of it, because I do think you end the treasury note, you end the U.S. Contribution to Forex exchange. You force you have to rely on total autarkic production, and then you have to really actually tax to raise revenues, not because the government needs the money, but the government needs the control over production. I mean, the rational core of MMT being true is big states can do that if they can compel other people to take their money. The reason why metalism keeps on coming up in history wasn't because metal has any inherent value, but it is transferable, meaning you can use value in it and have it abstract value, have it as Velben goods. You can do all kinds of things with it without depleting it as much as you do other goods. Like when you had currency as salt, for example, you use it, it's worthless. And it has its use value, right? Which is what we should care about as Marxists, but like its abstract value is nothing. It is true from looking at anthropology and stuff that internal to hunter-gatherer bands and stuff like that, you had what we call credit economies or honor economies. Honor economy is a kind of credit economy. But when you had groups that distrusted each other, they bartered. And both the MMTers and the Marxists kind of like hedge bets. So, there was no barter. Well, you're talking internal to these groups that had high trust. Oh no, it's all barter. You're talking external to groups where you have low trust. Marx thought when he wrote about this at the time that it's not that the idea that metal inherently had value was what he was unmotivated by. That's clear in the Grundrisse. What he thought is that no singular power could issue fiat currency and not have hyperinflation because other people wouldn't take their fiat currency because internal imperial competition was too high. And basically, since the 1970s, that has not been true in the Anglo-American zone, particularly after Bretton Woods. Now, people can make of that what they will. What this has to do with the bond markets is that without continuing to pay into those treasury goods, it's very hard to compel people to take your money because they can pretty much run around it. Yeah, Magax is right. Then you go into crisis because your imports get too pricey, or you draw down reserves and get into a balance of payment crisis. Exactly. If Marx was alive today, would he be buying bonds instead of gold? Well, you should ask, actually, if Engels was alive today, what would he be buying? Because Engels was the person who bought shit. If Marx was alive today, he'd be asking Engels for money. Just then. No, you know what people would be buying would probably be, I mean, the Chinese government's buying gold. Why would they be doing that? Well, they think we're returning to 19th century conditions. You know, they don't want the yuan being the same thing as a dollar because that would mean that they couldn't be making policy just for their own internal economy. It would also make production in China really fucking expensive, just like it did here. So they're not going to do that, but there's no clear replacement. The euro is also in decline. You know what's happened to the pound. All right. A lot of this trade imbalance is why I'm skeptical of Nico Virial's argument about the coming China reset. And that hypothetical, what's even China's role in the global economy anymore? Well, I think Nico is a little bit. Me and Nico have differed on our assessments of China for a long time. I think China is the most responsible power. I do think there are elements of the Chinese state that are trying to transition to socialism. And they're trying to do it by some market welfareism. You know, I don't question that. It's not my place to question to understand the mind of people and to question what they say. I know that in 1982 in the Chinese Constitution, they declared they reached socialism, but Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping and all those guys have not really talked like that. They push off necessarily socialist reforms being completed into a set time. Right now, it's about 2050. You did see Xi in particular, and this is why Jackson Hinkle likes him. And although Jackson Hinkle's recently claimed that none of the Douglas reforms that led to any improvement until about the time of Xi's return, I think that's foolish. When I looked at the numbers after my interview with Dongping Han, what I saw is the 1980s and 90s were brutal in China, and you saw a freezing of life expectancy around that time. You saw the non-education of rural girls. Like, I think people underplay the extremity of the Dengist liberalization. It wasn't neoliberalism, it was like ordoliberalism. But you started seeing improvements by 2006. You started seeing real improvements in both Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping tenure, and particularly during Xi, because Xi actually reinvested in the countryside. He started some mitigation programs for healthcare. By that I mean you have something like socialized medicine in China, which you really did not have in China. China had a system closer to the United States than even most Europe did. So that stuff has been tampered down on. It hasn't been shut down. You have seen counter recurrence of Han nationalism, et cetera, et cetera. I'd love to have Musa Al Garbi on the show, believe it or not. I like that guy's book. But there is a reason why Dungism has become more popular after Xi, even amongst Maoists, who Maoists traditionally, most of the different groups of Maoists did not like the PRC between 1982 and about 2012. That has only changed recently. And that is still somewhat controversial. I mean, you have seen a return of like classical Maoists in response to Dungist. But you know, and then there's been this whole ML, non-ML controversies and blah, 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 blah. Why does the Han nationalist mention Chinese people of various ethnicity constantly? Because, I mean, one, those aren't Han nationalists. Chinese nationalism is set up by Sun Yat-sen, so this even predates Mao, is plural nationalism. You know, when people mock that term, I mean, they're mocking what was set up by Mao, because there are the 5 recognized ethnicities under Sun Yat-sen. I think there's like 18 now from Mao forward. And I think people do, even the Han nationalists have to pay lip service to that. Just like American nationalists will, you know, pay lip service to it not being all about WASPs. Sometimes. Although that's going away as the masks are off, so to speak. Heg says, I've been reading Climate Leviathan. I interviewed that author like 3 years ago. What do you think about it? About an increasingly feral America pushing non-ideological alliance states into black fat, both consciously and unconsciously strengthened. Here's the issue. The other great powers have tensions amongst themselves. Right now, America's behavior is pushing them together. So India and Russia have been allies with tension in China at various times. Russia and China have notorious tensions, although they seem to be somewhat around. But you still haven't seen them, for example, like Russia and China were not willing to use their veto power even for Palestine. They weren't. All right. It's 50 or 60 now. Yeah, there's a bunch. So from underconsumption, developmentalism to decreased investment and increased household incomes. I don't think you're going to see increased household incomes everywhere. I don't think that's how things work. I'm not an immiserationist in the sense that I do not think that immiseration automatically makes the working class left wing. But in terms of how capital is likely to develop once you start having any kind of monopsony power, I do absolutely believe if you do not control capital, well, it is a common ruin of all. Period. Do you think clandestine edges had impact at all on what's happening? Because if China and Russia helped Palestine, wouldn't that undo years of propaganda? I think clandestine agencies aren't that competent. I'm sure they have a role in everything. I don't doubt that. But yeah. And yeah, you are right. If China didn't recognize the PLO government, it would give whatever DPP on Taiwan permission to do a rock move again, and I think that's fair. That's a fair point. Nation states have to act like nation states. My point is, you should not expect them to act like class interests. Don't be a fucking idiot. There's not a nation state on this earth currently that's not subject to the global market. The United States might not be the hegemon, the primary hegemon of that market for much longer. That was always going to happen no matter what happens. You don't have hegemons forever. But the idea that any of these nation states could just transcend capital as long as they're dependent on foreign exports and whatnot is ludicrous to me. And when it was tried in Cambodia and in the collective period of Mao's China, it didn't go so well. Now, I always find it funny that people talk about, like, market socialism has only been tried in Yugoslavia, because I was like, there are markets in the USSR. They weren't free at all. They were planned markets, but even with the 3 ruble system, at least in respect to the global market, which the USSR started participating in World War II and definitely during the Khrushchev period, forward didn't pull back from it. It wasn't just Gorbachev. Gorbachev just was the people who let the actual corporations in, but they were still messing with the global market. That was always there after World War II. War communism's really the only time you have autocratic communism. And by war communism, I mean like in the 30s and early 40s. What can be done with some arguments like USR, Cuba trade, nothing market changing. Immiseration in the United States is likely to lead to more workplace shootings and family annihilations and unionization, and that shit is grim. Well, I am a promoter of unions, but I have been very frustrated by people talking about the workers' movement. If there is a workers' movement in America, and I have people who watch me who think there is, and I'm going to listen to them, it is largely outside of the formal union movement and has to be because of the proportion of people in unionized jobs. And the growth of unionized jobs have been in new unions in sectors that don't have unions and are still highly ununionized, such as coffee. The industrial unions are not growing. For all the talk about Sean Fain and the UAW, you remember when Boschkar and Sankara was on that kick before Mamdani became the keys you can wave around when that wasn't going so well. The UAW is a massively declining union. Its growth sector is in TAs. The UAW is shrinking. The Teamsters, which is led by Sean O'Brien, who was put in power by a similar workers' empowerment movement, is somewhat growing, but it undercuts its competition all the time. Is there a union path forward? Well, unfortunately, the public sector unions are where the unions are. They also are still organized in ways that can organize because they are large groups of people and relatively concentrated workspaces, which is not true for everybody else. The assumption that, and this, I actually got into a brief argument with a long friend of mine in Marxist Union Group over this on Twitter once. He didn't respond to me, but it was an argument nonetheless, that monopolization unilaterally leads to more socialized workers is undone by the nature of technology, which since the middle of the 20th century has been consolidating technological capital into fixed capital forms, but dispersing production to make sure organization is harder. And all the liberals and all the leftists and all the anti-shitification people like Cory Doctorow can tell themselves what they want to believe. And Jacobin Magazine can sell you a million fucking magazines based off this, but it doesn't change that fact. The union density during this new workers movement, which again, I might even say is real, has not increased. And the union with the most power over the logistics train, you know, that thing that Kim Moody told us to focus on, is the Teamsters. One of the most conservative major unions. It isn't just like, you know, a guild union. Do you think the DSA would have a chance to pass the Democratic Party in red state elections? From an outsider's point of view, I'm bewildered by the Jedi price. Don't try, that's harder. The DSA isn't located in those areas. Even when the DSA exists, like it does here in Utah, in a very red state, it exists in the most liberal cities. The DSA, I think, has one chapter in my state. It is trying to find a chapter, I believe, in Ogden, which is about an hour north, which is also a purplish city. It's not going to touch the other university cities, partly because of what happened to Charlie Kirk, and I'm not kidding about that. Because DSA people were accused of shit. And I'm not going to go into that because I don't want to violate stuff that I shouldn't talk about on air. American socialists don't have a rural policy to speak of. And remember what I said earlier, for those of you who weren't here, from what I can tell, looking at the numbers, between an eighth and a tenth of the DSA is just in the greater New York City area. Benjamin Studebaker is not wrong about their geographic concentration being a major problem, because the DSA really is only strong historically in areas that are controlled by Democrats, because they are pivoting as a reaction to the Democrats. I listened to it. I went to the DSA training. That's what everyone's talking about. But we can't move past that. Now, do I think it's the way forward? Not unless it splits and becomes its own party. And I think that by itself would cause half the membership to leave. Am I wrong if I said Mondani won because of the downly mobile white professional middle class in New York? I would say the only thing that's wrong about that is white. There's lots of downwardly mobile Latin professionals and some black ones who are involved. Although the DSA has probably the least reach amongst the black community. Does the DSA run their own candidates outside of Democrats? I don't see what the point is. They guys, I told you they're an NGO. They can't. Their entire structure would mean they'd have to rewrite their own charter, rewrite their own financial structure, change their whole accountability system to do that. Now, but what you guys want? You want a sect that's going to run people? They fail miserably. What's the most any socialist sect in America? Even the CPUSA, when it was at one of its higher points in the 70s, and actually ran a candidate, which it didn't do for ever since Gus Hall died, was 1%. Both the old CPUSA of the 20s, which is arguably not even the same organization, the most it ever got was 2%. At its highest point of existence during the Popular Front in 1948, before all the Henry Wallace stuff and all that happened. I mean, after that, but before the Democrats started doing state level red scares. And yes, Democrats did that, but the Republicans did it first, but the Democrats started pushing for that at a state level before it happened in the 50s. And you also saw various weirdnesses of the SPA, the Socialist Party of America, being both pro the Popular Front with this communist, but also punishing sympathizers to the communists, like Victor Berger's fucking wife, as early as the 40s. So very strange. But nonetheless, all that aside, if most American socialists don't know American socialist history, the largest the DSA has ever been is probably right now. I think they've always claimed to be up to around 100K. I think the highest they hit prior to Mamdani is 85. They are now up to 90. But if there's another Democratic president, I predict they drop dramatically again, just like they did during the Biden administration. The Biden administration, they hit 85K, and they lost 20,000 of those people. And that's not accounting for the recruitment drives. I'll tell you one thing. I have not, I've only been in the DSA formally for about 2 months. I don't know how long I'm going to stay in it. I'm still making my decision there. Do I think it's the way forward? Like I said, only if it becomes a party. And I don't know how likely that is. But I don't see anything else in the horizon. But all that aside, the DSA is now at 90K. I can already tell you what most chapters are learning from Mamdani is that they need to run more candidates and move away from building the local infrastructure to be able to win local candidacies. So, they're trying to one union organizers and whatnot and their own cadre candidates as Democrats to oppose other Democrats. And in some cities, they've gotten 3 or 4 people elected, and some like Chicago and like New York, they have a fair amount. Enough to be a medium-sized power player in local politics. But most of these campaigns aren't going to work. I hate to be the guy who says this, but if you looked at what won the night of Mamdani's election, it was mostly standard Dems elsewhere. In a place where you didn't have Cuomo, where you don't have matching funds, where you don't have ranked choice voting. And it's also true that the unions, by and large, did not endorse Mamdani until very late. So this pivoting away from union work seems weird to me. So popular frontism is something I want people to move away from. But every time you have an electoral victory, people forget that nowhere on the planet has this worked except in opposition to a right-wing power. And then as soon as that opposition goes away, the Popular Front turns on each other and the centrists win. And either the Communist parties align with the Comintern or the Socialist parties are made to look like asshats, leading to reactions that led to things like postmodernism. People always like, postmodernism is a CIA thing to destroy. Okay, the CIA did pick up on it. You see the John Hopkins thing. But if you read what most of the postmodernists did, they responded to the Communist Party of Italy and the Communist Party of France failing. I have a book where Baudrillard talks about how angry he is about their capitulations to the Mitterrand government. It caused people to then theoretically make justifications for moving away from that, and then that got funding, and then this was perpetuated. But the cause of that was the formerly Comintern-affiliated parties moving to the right and tailing not even always socialist governments. So there you go. Yes, people are going to tell me that Zeron is better for NYC. It's better for the left. Yeah, it's better than Cuomo. I would have voted for him. Who the fuck cares? I'm going to tell you, though, you're going to have to quit fooling yourself about the bond market. That killed Brandon Johnson. That killed the mayor of Jackson plus the state legislature. That, you know, that has that killed Dennis Kucinich. It killed a lot of the progressive mayors too in the 70s and early 80s. If you do not take a realistic stance to that, I don't know what you're going to do. And the baffler, David I. Backer, who's coming on the show to talk about this in education policy, pointed out that every single progressive mayor has had to do this and has taken the fall for neoliberalization, whether they wanted to or not, because they cannot legally get around the bond market. Doesn't mean that Mamdani's bad. Better that than Eric Adams. Better that than, I would have voted for him. I want to be very clear on that. My critique is not about Mamdani's character. It's not about his intention. It's not about whether or not he's good for the left. It is not replicable in most municipalities, even as an electoral strategy. Remember, Mamdani's win, which he activated a massive amount of the city. But you know how much of the New York still voted even in this very, very activated election? 20%. 20%. Which is the most we've seen vote as a percentage of New York elections, probably the 60s. Okay? Municipal elections never, in some countries, would not even meet like necessary quotas for being democratically legitimate. And that Mamdani brought a ton of people out voting, and he still won by hair against one of the most unpopular fucking Democrats who went independent that we've known about. Is that replicable without matching funding? Is that replicable without ranked choice voting? No. And that's not even getting into what you're seeing. Like, again, I'm not saying Mamdani's bad. I'm not saying he's fake. Right? It may be really and truly that until you have a much more mass power base, both above and below, the best you're going to get is a de Blasio-like figure who maybe says socialism sometimes. I think the last election final boss was 40%, but it hovered around 20% for most previous elections, I think. I'm going to look it up because I did look this up recently. All right, continue talking while I talk about this. Oh, okay. Excuse me. I may have gotten this somewhat confused because there's been roundups. There's been the early estimates were wrong. Originally, it was projected that the estimated turnout was 19% of use. Now it's been rounded up to 28. Women and people of color propelled Mamdani's win, so that myth is actually false. Mostly being white, middle class, but it does seem like it was more women and more educated people. And then Black and Latino youth and white youth, Black and Latino youth voted at higher rates. But we're talking about youth. When I look at the overall rate, and I'm getting this from Tough Circle. 2 million New Yorkers cast a ballot. Now, what is the population of New York City? Let's see, in 2025, it is 8.8 million. Doing some math, 2 million is what percent of 8.8 million? Just doing some calculations in my head. Well, actually, the calculator. 22%. So still close to what I said. The prior averages, let's look at how many people voted, what percentage voted. Now, admittedly, we should probably adjust that upwards because I didn't check on who's actually eligible to vote. So it's probably let's just be generous and say 30%. Split the difference. All right. What percentage is the average mayoral turnout in New York? About 16%. And this was the biggest election since 1969 in New York City. Just doing the math and using some basic references before we accuse each other of just making shit up. No, you probably didn't mishear. I mean, I did see that there was a raise up of youth vote from 18 to 28, and youth vote is usually low, so it would make sense that older votes were higher. And thus would probably average out between 30 and 35, but I just looked at it. It's just that the New York municipal elections usually have like really low turnouts. Like, all right. So when people talk about like, oh, municipal socialism, like you have such low voter turnout at municipal elections, particularly on non-major election years. So yeah, make of that what you will. So actually, how many of those are eligible voters? Let's actually see how many eligible voters are there in New York City. That must be known. We know the population is 8.8 million, but how many eligible voters in New York City in 2025? There is no clear exact number for eligible voters in New York City for 2025. We only know turnout percentages and registered voters, not the eligible voting population. Yay. That's from the New York Board of Electors and also AI Overview. So have a great day. Jesus. Well, one of the things about replicating the Italian strikes is Italy is a small country with relatively large urban areas that used to have mass industrial production. What are we? A large country where most industrial production is automated, with vast swaths of unurbanized area, although the urban population is majority of the population, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You're not going to just replicate the past, guys. This is one of the things I keep saying. And people at Voting Blue, no matter who, after 3 years of genocide, should make you clowned on and after left circle, man. I think it's true. Yeah. Is a tax strike or general strike even possible or worthwhile? I mean, is what a tax strike that would only work if you have millions of people doing it. And I mean like a third of the population. So in the United States, that would be at least 100 million people. I want to remind you that the largest left organization in America, that is larger than the others by orders of magnitude, the highest estimate I've seen for the next down is 20K for the CPUSA, and I think that's a wild overestimate. The CPUSA has historically, after the 1950s, been between 3 and 7K. Furthermore, are you going to get people not to take your taxes out of your payroll? Are you just going to refuse? Are you just going to refuse? A rent strike is another interesting issue because you can write off the full cost of unpaid rent. This is why YIMBYism will flatten rents, but it won't really lower them. And I see this here in Salt Lake. We've been pushing large families out of the city, but we've been putting up tons and tons and tons of 1 and 2 bedroom apartments, just plastering them everywhere, any little speck of land. They are largely unoccupied, not completely unoccupied, but they have drastically slowed rent hikes. They have, but that's it. And the reason why is, what incentive do you have to lower rent? Because you can write off the losses as losses of income. Jacobin appears less delusional than it is, because Jacobin incorporates over a dozen different ideological positions from the academic left. Their expertise papers over false optimism. I not only agree with that, I will say they provide voice for about 15 or 16 different positions on the academic left. They are dominated by Catalyst Magazine, which is dominated by analytic Marxist social democrats. I hate to be the bad guy, but what's possible in a situation is a matter of what is politically necessary. Impossible from the perspective of the state of the situation. Yeah, CR Manor, you're right. You know, I'm not saying that like general strikes are possible, although the general strike has never happened. You seen a strike overthrow capitalism anywhere? Still looking around, but they do produce systemic changes. That's absolutely true. It is said way more robust left movements than the U.S. Absolutely, which is always wild to hear American leftism claim domestic Gladio operations when we don't even have a left that's like 5% as strong as Italy. Yeah, that's absolutely true too. I was like, you're not that important. Trashing analytic Marxist again. I'm not trashing analytic Marxist. They do some good analysis sometimes. I'm not an analytic Marxist. It depends on which one you talk about. But I will say Chibber's assertion that markets encourage honesty versus central planning because people lie, which I heard on Doomscroll, made me laugh out loud. But I think what what Eric Owen Wright was trying to do about figuring out the strata of the classes was way more analytically rigorous than like just screaming PMC all the time. But the political instincts of analytical Marxists are market socialism, which has been tried. Their whole thing against Gosplan, it's like Gosplan had markets in it, man. Like, I get why, however, we say that like Venezuela could not possibly have socialized all production without markets as soon as Chavez took over, because they couldn't have. They would have been a pariah state. If you want to look at the past, look at why during the height of union power it still hadn't enough hold onto and to advance workers' rights. It could, yeah. I really like Class Counts that I never finished it. I think his Understanding Class book was a weird hodgepodge of essays. The first two I really liked, and then the rest of them I thought were like they were dated before they were even published. And that was 10 years ago. Greatest interview I lost. I interviewed Eric Owen Wright at the end of my stay in Mexico with Amog Sahu for Symptomatic Redness. Have I ever done a pod about your critiques of Marxist socialism? No, I haven't. I do think Marxist socialism could be used as a it wouldn't be socialism, but it could be used as a way to increase the ability of the workers to have something to base, assaults on capital also. So I don't throw out all the market socialist suggestions, even though I don't think they're socialist, by a Marxist perspective. I also think we have to have conceptual nominalism on words. When some people say words, they mean different things than when other people say words. So fighting over it as if there's some platonic hole in it is nearly impossible. But I will say the socialist states that didn't neoliberalize were the ones that were sanctioned out of market socialism. Cuba and the DPRK. And the DPRK actually has liberalized, as now has Cuba. The DPRK is liberalized only in respect to Russia and China, and it's only in respect to markets, but it has done so. So, if you want to call it state capitalism, which Lenin did call it that, and he didn't mean it as an insult, then that's fine. But that's what you're really advocating for. The issue is, though, that also does not work only in one country. Capital flight, sanctions, etc., make it very precarious. And most of those states that try it end up trying to do it off of commodity productions. And the only ones who are successful at doing that are like Norway, who are in the imperial ring, although they might not be soon. Its early analysis was superior to the later. It got too Bavarian. I actually agree with you on that. For people like, Derick hates Varn, excuse me. I use my given name there. Analytic Marxist. I've read a lot of analytic Marxist. I think the original generation of analytic Marxists, and that's not just G.A. Cohen, which everybody likes. I don't actually love G.A. Cohen. I think he reduces Marxist progressivism down to the most Whiggish. I mean, weirdly, G.A. Cohen's defense of Marxist theory of history is a defense of the Soviet theory of history, but made Whiggish, and with the Soviets losing. The Iberian relies on Max Weber. Wait for Trump to send death to force into the North Sea. Oh God. Rome wasn't burnt in a day, people. Marxism was invented by secularists to make the criticism of Kemalism impossible. You guys are funny. Question: Umberto Eco's birthday today. Any negative, neutral, or positive feelings? Umberto Eco was the first theorist I was really into. Back when I was a conservative, but I maintained that my entire life. I think his theory of semiotics, while it has some problems, gives us something like an ability to start mapping human strokes. So when is the U.S. balkanizing? I don't know. I mean, weirdly we were. So yeah. Anyway, I'll answer one question first because I get scattered. I like Umberto Eco. I love his literature. I don't think he was particularly radical. That Fascism essay has done way more damage than good. But the other thing that's done damage is the idea that just because something isn't exactly fascism, that it's somehow okay or just normal. So make of that what you will. Travels in Hyperreality, which is an Umberto Eco book, not a Baudrillard book, despite what people think, is one of my favorite books. I read it when I was 19. For those of you who don't know, I'm 45. And I still have Umberto Eco's book on semiotics somewhere around here. Maybe I only have an electronic copy now. All right. What if some more periphery states have successful market socialism? Why the idea of socialism through third world so popular? The idea that socialism through third world is popular because national liberation movements actually tend to happen and succeed. The reason why it's a critique, though, is very few of them stay socialist because they tried market socialists, ended up needing capital, have to run through that phase themselves, but they're not strong enough to build up their own industrial production. So they get subsumed by capital as imperialist incentives and become part of the world system in the periphery. Duvere and Howard Scott and energy vouchers. Which Howard Scott? Howard Scott was a friend of mine, but I doubt you're talking about that Howard Scott. So when is the U.S. balkanizing? It kind of already, what I was saying earlier about the balkanization kind of already has, in some degree, started down that path by Trump making the regional courts binding only on regions, which is going to bind economic stuff more tightly in regions. And since COVID, it's been clear that the state level response is where most things happen at, and regional coalitions are mattering for that a lot more than the national government is even. That's the beginnings of balkanization. That's the kind of stuff that if you think about like what happened when like one day you're a Roman and you don't even know the Roman Empire's fallen and you have an Ostrogothic king or Visigothic king. Ostrogoths in Spain. I'm gonna end this soon. I'm gonna only go for 2 hours. I got to record again tonight and then go to bed. Oh, I mean, Technocracy Inc.'s Howard Scott. So I need to cover Technocracy. There's a lot of liberals talking about Technocracy Inc. and their view of the technate being all of America's and that being a sign of imperialism as as Musk's granddad was part of the Technocracy Inc., although Musk's granddad was kicked out of Technocracy Inc. for being a fascist sympathizer. And Technocracy, in the documents I've read, did believe in a technate, but they believed it would happen willingly by removing politics from everyday life. The North Americas would consolidate, and they were perfectly okay with movement between the Americas. My problem with it's fascism people, John Gantz is a quintessential example here, is there's so much puff for what amounts to endless popular frontism with the Democrats. Well, that seems to be the case. Yeah. Emergence of a alternative currency wherever the entente is also something that balkanization is in the air. I mean, if cryptocurrency becomes a major backer of the US dollar, I think you're right about that. The Roman Empire didn't fall. It continued until 1458 in Constantinople. Yeah, I know. I screwed up today and said in the middle of the 13th century it fell, and I actually meant the middle of the 15th century because my aphasia flipped the numbers. But that was on Twitter today. But that was my point. Well, like you talk about the fall of an empire, empires balkanize and parts of the empires exist. And often the successor states of those empires, let's say the Ottomans, which I've been hearing a lot about this 150, 250 year empire cycle. And I'm like, where are you getting that from? The Eastern Roman Empire existed for 1,000 years. The Ottomans existed for like 800. Maybe not 800. Let's think. The Ottoman Empire in its full instantiated form from Osman, about 600. Maybe it's more like Henry Perrine's phrase. He says, where empires don't fall until there's major disruption in trade networks. Yeah. The one I've heard is that we're out of the Roman Republic age and are now in the Roman Empire age, except that we were always an empire in the first place. So was Roman Republic. Ah. The British Empire is like 150, 100 years. Well, I mean, it was longer than that because the British Empire clearly existed when it established colonies in the Americas in the 16th century. So there is an empire, of some form from the settler colonies on to, World War II. And I mean, they're still losing colonial holdings. So, Raven from Ramen Brinches announce you all as Neo-Smithians. The funny thing is, I was on Brenner's side for a long time in these Brenner versus Wallerstein debates. I do think that capitalism got its first national form in England, although I think that fully instantiated capital actually happened in the Dutch colonies, but then so does Brenner. Not Meerkens Wood, though, and that's where Chibber gets it from. I also think, of course, elements of imperialism, just like elements of markets, predate the modern capitalist system, but that modern imperialism begins concurrently and immediately to the modern capitalist system in the instantiation of what happened in Ireland. And I think the Irish writings of Marx make that Marx thought that was true very clear. Marx's thoughts on like indigenous peoples in the Americas and stuff were kind of all over the place. Don't get me started on, Marx didn't like Simon Bolivar because he was racist. And I was like, well, Simon Bolivar was racist. Like, go read his own writings. Am I watching Pluribus? No. Why this civilizational thinking? Because a lot of people don't think in class terms. You asked me why I'm talking about empires or civilizations. What drives empires is basically their trade routes and material production, which means their internal heartbeats are class conflicts and class contradictions. What happened to the business cycle? We were supposed to get a recession like 4 years ago. Well, you had a massive removal of production capacity during COVID. Everywhere else did have a recession 4 years ago. We kind of didn't, but it looks like you are hitting it now. So the business cycle still clearly exists. Also, you even see the business cycle in supposedly non-capitalist countries in their slowdown cycles. What changes the business cycle, though, is that the business cycle seems to be driven by the conflict between labor demands and markets. And right now, the biggest market is the government. How did all your tech billionaires get rich? It was using government contracts to establish monopoly power and then kick this ladder down. You might call that techno-feudalism, but, that's also how the East India Company got rich. It's how capitalism has always worked. Also, we are in the midst of a recession at current. You just have a massive AI bubble on top of it, which is providing the stock market a lot of liquidity and revenue. And I'm not sure it's going to burst all at once. You're going to have this big 2007 like burst, I actually think you're going to see a slow die off like you saw of the overvalued stocks in the 1970s, which leads to what? Stagflation. What are you seeing right now? Stagnant rations, low hiring, and by the way, low hiring in a population that is shrinking. I'm going to put that to you. Low hiring in a population that's shrinking, but people are still reporting this in terms of percentages of people claiming unemployment. How severe was COVID for the future? I think that we overblame COVID. COVID accelerated a bunch of things that already were happening. Yeah, mostly public. Most of the I love when I had this libertarian in 2017 hold up an iPhone. It's like, this was made by capitalism. I was like, actually, most of it was developed by multiple countries with public discourse. Almost all of it in the that was developed in the United States was either purchased after the fall of the Soviet Union or stolen from Soviet development, or it is independent development that happened under DARPA and in the Defense Department. In fact, if AI is to be believed, AI is probably the first major technological shift in the last 100 years to have come from business development, and even then, it looks like it was an accident. Thoughts on the future of Zoomer Marxist? I hope the illiterate Stalinist is a passing fad. I think that we have our anti-communism to blame for this Marxist-Leninism. I don't like using the term Stalinism because it's vague. I know it's like the Maoist who thinks that China is capitalist, and the Hojist who thinks that Stalin was the best thing ever, but we don't talk about anything past 1951. And the Dungists who want to make the Sino-Soviet split disappear, but also say China was right in it, all are Stalinists. What does that mean? But I do think that most Zoomer leftism of all varieties is unfortunately only slightly more literate than the society that's producing it. I did say once that even though I like some Michael Parenti books, that the sign that Michael Parenti was everyone's big theorist, a guy who wouldn't even join a Marxist-Leninist party, was probably going to be a bad sign. And now we're arguing about the CIA's influence over academics in the 50s as if that explains everything that happened to communism in the 20th century, which even Gabriel Rockhill doesn't seem to think that that's completely explanatory. But then why make such a fucking big deal out of it? AGI is going to push to the consumer, and depending on how many people already think ChatGPT thinks, people will think it's genuine AGI. Yeah, I know. AGI will necessarily be a fraud, at least at the current level. There's no way LLMs would produce anything like AGI. The conflict with Iran is currently ongoing. Yeah, it definitely is. And I'm wondering if Israel is going to finally take the bait on that. You need to publish books, of course. I do need to publish books, I guess. I need to finish an article I promised I'd co-write with Daniel Tutt. For those of you wondering about the Lash book, the reason why it stalled is, one, my original co-author finished her dissertation, was still super busy. She lost interest in Lash studies, and we didn't come to any agreement on the meaning of certain things in Lash. Two, there were things about Lash's explanation that his students told us were tied to his personal life that we do not feel like we can verify in print. And I'm not going to repeat it here because I don't feel like I can verify it. And three, I started thinking that Lash's thinking started going awry in 1987, and that he started, in his entire career, he was very confused on working class meant. So he was talking about the working class in like colonial Americas when he meant yeoman sharecroppers and people who had no direct tie to commodity production, and talking about that as a working class culture, which then explains why after 1988, when he wrote The True and Only Heaven, he started promoting the early Republican artisan as a prototypical model for American populist reform. And also, he jumped from his earlier critique of populism. He did a brilliant critique of populism in the late 60s against Michael Harrington, of all people, but then abandons it in the 1980s after flirting with communitarianism to try to invent a kind of alternate working class traditionalism that he can appeal to. And he died from cancer, but his last writings were on women and also on... He got obsessed with George Sorel and myths, which I had accused him in 1988 of trying to build a mythic working class, but I discovered in one of his last interviews in Chile's magazine that he really was trying to do that. Ugh. Did you read Attack on Titan? Do you think it's fascist sympathizing? I mean, aren't most animes and most superhero anything fascist sympathizing? Except for Superman. Sure, I did. I tried to read it. I got bored. I got about three trade mangas in. What good is McNair's unite the left rhetoric when so many of the sects just fundamentally aren't left communist at all? I mean, I do think it's interesting to read his left-wing strategy book, and he talks about how you have to cut out the rightists, but we don't do that. And the other thing is, when McNair says that, he does think means unite the left on programmatic grounds, which means you'd have a reason to say who is and is not left. But we can't get that far, so we only have ideological, vague affiliation groups. Varn, have societies with our level of intellectual degeneration been able to pull themselves out of it and recover? Yes. The 11th century Roman Empire and the East. That's one that Joseph Tainter states in the Collapse of Complex Societies as one of the few societies that was able to re-gear its intellectual elites and survive an overcomplication crisis, because overcomplication crisis means that you do have lots of talent and specialization going into smaller and smaller niche things, which require more and more social energy to protect, which leads to elite overproduction and a bunch of other problems. But it also leads to things like the inability to support your trade routes, no one having enough general knowledge to actually run anything. So there have been societies that reversed it. The issue is Tainter finds like 7 of them in all of human history. By far, the most likely scenario is when you get into the situation, it's collapse. The issue that Tainter says is, Tainter, of course, being a social ecologist, he won't say capitalism. But he says we live in a worldwide industrial society. And that's kind of true. Make of that what you will. But basically, he's implying that we don't know what happens when you have societies as integrated on the world scale as this. We are in terminal energy and ecological crisis. I can't see work with simplification if I squint. Trying to put together a group of like-minded to talk about these issues. I'm interested. I mean, that was EndNote's preposition. To know the civilizations were American, though. Oh, God. The eunuchs were blamed for ruining Han China. You guys make me laugh. Okay, it's almost 2 hours, and I've said I'm going to actually keep a timeline on these things. Were you talking about the collapse of societies from Tainter? Yes, I was. It's after Capitals Volume 1 through 3. It's the books I reference the most. Can we return for some more oral teaching to make up for poor literacy? I don't know. It seems to be a less thoughtful trend among the young and frankly older people too. I'm doing oral literacy now. I started writing by hand to start writing again, by the way. Luke Kim's Goliath Carts has actually got some interesting stuff in it. I'm actually reading that. It's on my reading list. I'm putting it down to finish Vulgar Marxism and the Rock Hill book so that I can decide if I'm going to weigh in on that at all. uh, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, hey, before you guys go, I do have an announcement. Tomorrow I will be on TIR talking about this Venezuela thing. I'm sure, and I'm trying not to be Dr. Doom because Dr. Doom is a thing that people do on YouTube and they get people in these gaslit cycles. But it'll be me, Ben Burgess. I think Jason will be there. I'm not sure. Maybe he won't be. Maybe it's just me. We'll have about an hour and a half conversation about it on Wednesday. 3 streams with Gene. Also, I have an interview with Sudip Bhattacharya that comes out tomorrow as well. And I'm trying to get something every day this week. So yeah. I am back. I am not dying. So I haven't been dying for a while. I mean, we're all dying, but you know, I haven't been dying quickly for a while. We're also doing a McIntyre reading group. You're welcome to come in for that. If you're not a patron, that's okay. I'll let you in. If you just show up. So Sudip is coming on tomorrow. I'm coming on after that on TAR. They'll be stacked back to back. I don't like normally doing that, but I don't really know a way not to. And TIR, this is really for TIR. Just gonna blast it out here too. On Wednesday, streams with Gene. We're doing our quarterly streams with Gene. Why are so many public school teachers shit libs? I mean, that's kind of easy. Who funds them? And also, let's be honest, teaching is becoming like journalism. You have to be well married or from an already rich background to want to do it. Not because it's low paying. That's actually a myth. It's not particular. Its earning cap is really low. Like you cap out pretty quick. But your starting salary is usually slightly above, and in some places a lot above median salary. It's not in Utah. I think we're just at median salary, but yeah. Ben is a great guy. I'm not intellectually simpatical with him all the time either, but he's honest. And he doesn't like when I disagree with him, it's not because he's changing his opinion to fit popular opinion on any day. Like when I think Ben is wrong, it's something I think Ben is wrong about for like 15 years. And we're just going to discuss it. I deeply respect him. He had a we have very different stances on Chibber and Brenner. And we had a very polite conversation about it. Because he knows that I don't like his favorite book by Chibber, and he is neutral on Brenner, and I am very much not. I used to be a Brenner fan. I have become slightly more sympathetic to Wallerstein. Blah 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 blah. He argues against a lot of straw men. Yeah, he does. Can I sign up for the reading group on Patreon? Look in the email and look for my email in the show notes to this channel. Not show notes, to the channel notes. It is there. There's a way to email me and send me the email, and I'll send you a Discord link, and you can look for a theory group and join. But anyway, so I have a lot to say. I'm pretty angry, but I'm less angry than I used to be. I don't really see the point in being angry all the time. So there we go. Anyway, I'm rambling. And I'm tired. And I need to record another video tonight to have enough material for this week. So on that note, and I still have to grade. You have a good time. doing whatever. Yeah, don't become reactionary by being online. I think some of the worst habits in human beings come from parasociality, including decreasing empathy for people you don't need to decrease empathy for, increasing empathy, this is not talked about, for like leaders and figures you identify with who you definitely don't need to increase empathy for, etc., etc., etc. Healthcare cuts into Texas pay, the teachers' pay. Healthcare cuts into everybody's pay, man. My brother's a physical therapist, and another brother of mine is, doesn't have healthcare at all. But his healthcare costs are like almost as much as my damn teacher's paycheck for a family of four. And he, yeah. Protect your peace. Bye.